This has to be good news, doesn't it? Surely, hopefully, maybe, possibly. Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 9th of October 2023. I am joined as ever by my co-host Mr. Andy Brockman, and of course we're recording in the context of human tragedy. It's been just under a week since a horrendous attack unfolded in Israel, perpetrated by Hamas. And we're about to see the response of the IDF and the Israeli government to that attack unfold, apparently within the next few hours. So we figured it would be unsuitable to start with our normal banter back and forth this week. It's to be honest, this morning I'm feeling quite unhappy, quite sad, and we figured it would just get straight into the news. Really, do you have any thoughts that you want to add to that, Andy?
Well, apart from the fact that obviously we are in the process of watching it, third hand, an ongoing human tragedy, both in southern Israel and in Gaza, and where the main casualties appear to be innocent civilians on either side. So I think you're right to highlight it first of all, and also to perhaps for a week at least refrain from my usual banter. But I do think there's an important issue. I don't think we should get into the weeds of the rights and the wrongs of the situation in Israel, Palestine, Gaza. There are many people with more experience and more knowledge of those that area, which I think it would be much more fruitful for our viewers to look at if they want to follow up on how this has come about and maybe why, and even more importantly, what ways out of it there are. But I do think that there's one aspect of what's happened and what we've seen unfold since last Saturday morning that is relevant to archaeologists and heritage people, and that's what I'd like to begin with.
Presumably you're talking about galaxy brain Elon Musk himself to begin with, and his treatment of this on his X platform. That is to say, the platform called X, not the platform that may soon no longer exist.
Well, if the European Union have anything to do with it, that's a real possibility, and I'll come to that in a minute. Yes, I am. There have been issues with Elon Musk's very activist involvement in Twitter, X, since he took over. And a lot of it has been controversial in that as a self-proclaimed free speech absolutist, he brought back what are seen as right-wing accounts that were previously blocked. For example, Donald Trump's being the most famous, although Trump appears not to have taken advantage of the fact that he's been allowed back onto Twitter. But in the worst cases, it's been his promotion or apparent promotion of right-wing accounts, anti-immigrant accounts, appearing to repost things without actually caring where they come from, what the source is. And that's been upsetting to many. It's been really upsetting to people who regarded Twitter as a credible source of up-to-the-minute information. That was ruined by Musk taking away the blue tick check mark of for legitimate commentators and media organisations like Washington Post and BBC and so on, and making the BBC a paid check mark that anybody could apply for. But everything really came to a head, I think, and certainly for me, with what happened over the weekend, with the response to the Hamas atrocities in southern Israel on the X platform. There have been a number of very credible reports and analyses of what's gone on in the mainstream media. Wired is one example. Rolling Stone magazine also had a detailed article about the kind of issues that have been thrown up. But I want to highlight just one element of it. This is an account on X belonging to Elliot Higgins. Elliot Higgins is the person that runs an organisation called Bellingcat. They're probably the leading exponents of what's called OSINT, open source intelligence, and putting into the public domain. They've analysed things like the crash of MH17 over Ukraine and then the shoot down by a Russian missile system. They've also looked at issues in Ukraine and so on. They've got a long track record in analysing basically information, and particularly false information, and exposing false information. And on October the 10th, Elliot Higgins published a thread analysing what had been happening on X, and in particular a report that went viral on X very early on in the Israeli government's response to the Hamas atrocities, when it began mounting airstrikes and artillery strikes into Gaza, into the Gaza Strip and Gaza City. A post appeared saying, breaking, this is on a DD Geopolitics on X, breaking, this is with an Israeli flag and a Palestinian flag. Breaking, Israel has reportedly bombed the Christian church of St. Porphyrius in Gaza. It has been almost fully destroyed. St. Porphyrius was the largest church in Gaza. It was picked up by accounts. An account called Syrian Girl published, breaking, Israel has just bombed the third oldest church in the world in Gaza, St. Porphyrius. World, this is a travesty. And then in cap lock, calling on the Orthodox Church, wake up, Zionism is Satanism. And then another account, the same account posted, as an Orthodox Christian, I'm disgusted and hope we all end all foreign aid to Israel, and so on. It went on like that. There was one big problem with that. It was completely untrue. Higgins points out that the account, DD Geopolitics, is in fact a renaming of what Higgins describes as a pro-Putin, anti-Ukrainian Donbass Devushka account. It changed the account name when the real identity was reported back in April. In other words, it's a pro-Russian, pro-Putin disinformation account. It's been around for months. And it's still there on X. And the point I would make about this, that particular post, suggesting that Israel, obviously the Jewish state, had bombed an Orthodox Christian church in Gaza, that's designed to anger the Orthodox Christian world. As I say, it happened to be completely untrue. And so all I would say is, wherever you stand on the arguments around Israel-Palestine, and it is probably one of the most contentious and intractable situations on the planet at the moment, and is becoming the more so, it's really important that the sources you read, the sources where you get your news, the sources which help you form your opinions, you are confident that they are legitimate, that they provide checks and balances, and that they don't take the statements of either side at face value unless they're cross-checked and shown to be accurate, or where they're shown not to be accurate, that those inaccuracies are highlighted.
And the thing is, we saw, especially in the first months of the Ukrainian, the Russian war in Ukraine, we did see and observe a whole host of ways in which information could be misunderstood at best or actively manipulated at worst, and the ways in which different people absolutely benefit from that. But in this instance, what 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 we also have and are seeing is on social media is people with agendas that are really knotty, really hard to actually pull apart. So, in the case of essentially a Putin bot account, the motivations and reasons for posting in that way could be as simple as destabilizing and being a force for rumor, if not downright information chaos. Or there could be a whole other reason that on an international geopolitical stage really has nothing to do with the actual reality of what's happening on the ground, but rather to do with perception and the movement of people's attention in certain directions. And so, in that sense, you don't want to be part of, as it were, part of the problem, or at least one shouldn't want to be part of the problem. However, we have seen, this isn't easy. We have seen even our national news, I say even, we've seen several of our national newspapers rushing to publish information. I won't describe the information for which there's really only one source, and that is an IDF soldier talking to a journalist in Israel. And for which there's been no follow-up information. There's been no follow-up confirmation. There's been no follow-up investigation. In fact, the statement from the IDF says that they will not be investigating this, understandably as well, because they're busy at the moment. So in that sense, you can look at that in various ways. But the point is, the rush to tell a sensational story is tempting, and it's tempting even for national newspapers and their front pages. So it's understandable why people would want to repost something. Go, oh my goodness, have you seen this? But we need to be careful in terms of what the implications are. I mean, in this instance, it's. Very briefly, is it worthwhile talking about the likelihood of places like that being targeted? In that sense, it came out of so out of left field. It's clearly designed to inflame
Yes.
and arouse people's ire. But is the IDF or is Hamas remotely interested in destroying a building like that?
And the short answer is we don't know.
No.
We have seen very graphically what Hamas's fighters on the ground did
Yes.
in southern Israel, and it is ugly and heartbreaking and disgusting. And we're also seeing very graphically the result of the work of the IDF's targeteers in Gaza, and other decisions that the Israeli government has made, including imposing a complete blockade on energy, water, the things that make a modern society run and enable it to be, modern city life to be survivable and livable. So we're in a very dark place at the moment, and this stuff is only adding to it. The reason I wanted to highlight this particular story, though, is that as you're suggesting, heritage, culture. We talk about culture wars most of the time. Thankfully, it's just words, although that can be bad enough and distressing enough. Here, you have the potential, as we've seen in Ukraine, for a culture war to become a physical thing. But also, I think I wanted to highlight really the role of fake news and disinformation in the ongoing conflict. And by pointing out disinformation and fake news relating to a heritage site, I think I wanted to point out to our viewers that It's very tempting to make archaeology a wonderful, fluffy sharing thing, but it can also be weaponized. And it has been weaponized. History's been weaponized in the past by, for example, the Christchurch mosque shooter who murdered Muslims at prayer, in the name of a fake white supremacist crusader ideology, citing the Knights Templar and the Great Replacement Theory and all sorts of other bullshit. And so when people say, for example, why bother engaging with the likes of Graham Hancock and Eric von Daniken and Ancient Aliens and so on, I would say we have to engage with the grift and the fakery and the misrepresentation, because that's the gateway drug. And not often perhaps, but in the worst cases and with the worst of the bad actors, that kind of fakery, that kind of misrepresentation, that kind of misuse of history and archaeology kills people.
Well, we've linked below to 3 links, one of them about Elon Musk in particular from Wired, as Andy said, Rolling Stone talking about trolls pushing video game clips as real-life Gaza conflict footage, and also that link on X, aka Twitter, from Elliot Higgins. So you can check those out below. And yeah, it's absolutely a worthwhile thing to always point out whenever these sorts of conflicts unfold. Speaking of difficult conversations, the government, our government, has finally released their formal guidance on what they call retain and explain. This is published. This has been published in the title, at least, of this document, or of this press release. Sorry, to protect historic statues. Guidance published to advise custodians facing calls for the removal of heritage assets in their care or ownership. Would I be right in saying this has its roots in possibly the work of the previous culture minister?
Yeah, Dynamite Dorries, Nadine Dorries of blessed memory. The now ex MP for Mid Bedfordshire. Her replacement is being chosen next week. In fact, yes, it's the government put in place an advisory board to advise on statues, contentious statues, and basically it wanted, I think, a fig leaf for its sort of reaction that you should never, even if somebody was a massive war criminal and slave trader, and that their statue was put up 100 years after they died by a small group of white men in the late 19th century to celebrate this person and their achievements. They should be there in perpetuity and not be removed from a museum. I'm being cynical, but not for the first time, you might point out. But yeah, look, it's the current Culture Secretary Lucy Fraser launched this in her speech at the Conservative Party conference last week. It ticks all the usual government boxes. It talks about, or she talks about, history is nuanced and complex. It's full of grey areas. Nobody's going to deny that. Which is what makes it so interesting. And of course, there are times when statues and monuments depict people or events that we very much disapprove of today. No shit, Sherlock. She didn't say that. That was me. And then she says, at the same time, the UK has a proud history as an engine for progress, democracy and liberal values. That's why I want all our cultural institutions to resist being driven by any politics or agenda. Black Lives Matter. And to use their assets to educate and inform rather than seek to erase parts of our history we are uncomfortable with. Now, unpicking that, we could spend the rest of the show. I'm not going to. We've covered these issues many times before.
Yeah.
Apart from the fact that one of the main lines of attack from Lucy Fraser doesn't use the word woke in these comments. Other people do. And I was watching an interview last night when Jacob Rees-Mogg was interviewing Nigel Biggar, who's one of the leading commentators behind this move to, I'm tempted to say whitewash figures who have rather dark histories. But it's the idea
would that be erasing history?
Well, the argument is that Bigger's argument is, and he's just written a long book about it, is that the British Empire wasn't such a bad thing. That for every massacre of or ill treatment of people calling for change and government by local people and indigenous people and so on, Britain left a legacy of law and parliamentary democracy, and taught people to read and sent them to, it's whataboutery basically, but that's what she's talking about in that second comment about an engine for progress, democracy and liberal values. It's the fact that Britain was one of the first countries in the Northern Hemisphere to abolish slavery, but it took a long period of time, and when the compensation was given, it was given to the slave owners, not to the slaves, the enslaved people.
Yeah, and it also happened in a very particular economic and geopolitical context where slavery was becoming an embarrassing and also overly expensive thing to pursue anyway.
Precisely.
We didn't just do it because we wanted to do it. Sorry, just very briefly, that whole argument implies that we began the international slave trade in order to be benign enders of slavery within the British Empire. Anyway,
it doesn't stack up.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Anyway, we are where we are with this. To a certain extent, I think some of the heat has gone out of the statues issue. Obviously, it was red hot, white hot during the case of the dunking of Sir Edward Colston in Bristol Harbour, which kicked this whole thing off, really. It was a Grade 2 listed statue that was torn down by Bristolians who were sick and tired of asking for it to be taken down for decades. Colston being a leading light in the trade in enslaved African people to the West Indies in the late 17th, early 18th century. But he endowed lots of schools, so he was a good guy. And so, but since then, and other things have happened. The political discourse has moved on. The anti-woke agenda has taken on different targets. The latest being pretending that your local authority is going to stop you going to the shops unless you can walk there in 15 minutes. It's a constantly moving target. We also happen to be in the middle of the annual attempt of Restore Trust to infiltrate the National Trust Council. We've talked about that in previous weeks and previous years. So basically what this does is put moving monuments into the planning system. That's essentially what this is about. It makes it more difficult to remove a statue. It puts in place a policy of retain and explain. Doesn't mean things can't ever be removed.
The thing is, to be fair, retain and explain probably is quite sensible. The thing is, the retention doesn't have to be in pride of place. So if you look at, for example, I believe in the Natural History Museum, they have moved a statue a few meters, put it in a glass cabinet and retained and explained it. There's lots of information about why that statue is now where it is. So hopefully there's some wriggle room here that means that we're not just unthinkingly keeping statues in place that have no relevance to modern society. I've said this many times before when we've talked about this, but a statue that's still standing isn't at the end of its life. It's as simple as that. Archaeologists don't tend to find statues standing up. They almost always topple, and that's because society makes decisions over what it wants to keep and why. And also, just briefly, this notion of that people when they're making this case, it's often government ministers, or indeed even the prime minister will say things like, we don't want to see our history being erased, even the difficult parts, blah 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 blah. But the irony there is that I didn't know Colston's name until the statue was toppled, actually. So in that sense, history was restored to an awful lot of people's consciousness. But also as well, the whole point of that statue and moving it was to restore that narrative, was to not so much erase or to ignore difficult history, but to actually point at it, highlight it, and say this statue is here because of, in addition to the lovely things that he's done in the city, installing schools and spending money in various civic ways. This also happened. That's restorative. That's not erasure. I know you know this, Andy. I know most people watching this know this, but I just find that fascinating. It's a thread that's being pulled on in the US as well quite a lot at the moment. This idea of the ironic notion that access to more information and more ideas is somehow an act of destruction, as opposed to an act of augmentation. But again, you have to have a very particular point of view to believe that. You have to believe that anything that's not what you already think you know is dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, I just make another couple of quick points just to finish.
That's my TED talk over. Thank you.
Yeah, no. First of all, in the notes to editors, it's really interesting. And it makes this clear in the guidance as well. But the press release is the précis, obviously, what the government wants out there. And in the notes to editors at the bottom of the press release, it says this guidance does not include museums and gallery collections, including objects on temporary or permanent display or in storage. In other words, don't use this to talk about the Parthenon marbles or the Benin bronzes.
Yeah.
No.
Or I suppose actually they could arguably be foreseeing there a situation where something goes on to temporary display and then is put back into storage, and people go, "Oh, you're moving a statue,"
It's it's even more. It's made even more explicit actually in the next bullet points. It says that it doesn't apply to items that do not form part of a building or structure, right? Items that may be placed on in place on a temporary basis, so like a temporary art installation or something like that, or items that are part of an exhibition. That's fair enough. But then the qualifier is fascinating. This may include items owned by institutions that are subject to restitution claims.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
So you can't use retain and explain to block a restitution claim.
Interesting.
Isn't it just?
Does the right hand talk to the left in government these days or not?
I think the DCMS, the civil servants at the DCMS and the press people at the DCMS who will have drafted this know exactly what they're talking about. They know exactly what that reference is. Their antennae are tuned to try and avoid problems for the minister. The problem comes when they have a minister like Ms. Dorries, whose idea of what was true was what she said. And whose idea of risk was, what's the risk of not getting this onto the front page of a Daily Mail? But there's one other point I wanted to just, two other points actually, just briefly. One is that it cites, and this is an area you'll be very well aware of because of Mrs. Soup's family background, and but that is that one of the members of the board putting this together was Mukesh Sharma, MBE, who is the trustee for Northern Ireland of the National Heritage Memorial Fund, and cites in a comment, being part of the multidisciplinary team creating the contested heritage guidance was a fulfilling experience, allowing me to apply my knowledge of handling multifaceted contestation in Northern Ireland to wider discussion around how the heritage sector should respond to calls for statues and other memorials to be removed. And obviously you immediately think of, for example, the tradition in Belfast of painting very partisan murals on gable ends of housing terraces and houses. And the how to deal with that contested heritage has been an issue since the peace process in the 1990s, and actually is now part of the North of Ireland and Northern Ireland tourist offer.
Well, it is, yeah. I suppose I can hear Mrs. Soup's voice in my ear. I would just
That's
add,
why I wanted to mention
I would
it.
just
Yeah.
add slightly to that and say that it's ironic though, given that specific attempt at sensitivity and awareness, that this same government, in particular the Minister for Northern Ireland, etc., try and tell people in Northern Ireland how and when and where to fly their union flags. So on the one hand, you can say, "Oh, well, this art that represents, partisan division between loyalists and Republicans on different gables. This is something to be retained and to be, as you say, part of the tourist offer. But you better bloody well fly the flag when we tell you to and where we tell you to. It's schizophrenic, shall we say? It's a little bit odd, and that's not. And in that sense, by pointing that out, I'm not saying whether I think the Union flag should be flown in all instances and where and when. I'm not expressing an opinion on that. What I am expressing is, what I'm highlighting through caricature is the weird relationship between, I suppose, power, history, culture, and living culture. That is the people on the ground who actually are every day negotiating what these things mean for themselves and for each other. It's it's interesting, and it's interesting to see once you have a bit more of a connection to people who live in those sorts of parts of the world, to see how actually these issues are treated. But often also as well, they're treated with a veneer of benign intent. It's fascinating, and then again, this is also something I was sensitive to growing up in Wales. I mean, it's never easy seeing a government outside your country guiding your country in different directions.
It's not just outside your country, though. There's one final line I'd like to highlight, which I found really curious when I was reading this press release and the guidance. And it's in the press release, and it says it talks about the guidance confirming how to deal with calls for the removal of heritage assets, and that they need to be rigorous, transparent, and rooted in a comprehensive assessment of a person or event, and not on partial interpretations, which is fine. And then it goes on to say, it also highlights that custodians have a responsibility to consider the views of those who cannot be consulted, such as past and future generations. So we have to, we're told that we have to take into consideration that people in the past might have been oblivious to the idea that Sir Edward Colston was a racist exploiter of kidnapped black people. And that perhaps maybe future generations might wish to celebrate him, even though he was a kidnapper and economic exploiter of kidnapped black people.
But also that talked about not having a partial view of the character.
Yeah.
Whereas the statue represents nothing but a partial view of the character. It's imploring you to have a holistic view. The implication being the holistic view will be one that we agree with as the government. It's just
and in the case of Colston, which is again, where and to a degree, and also Cecil Rhodes, but Colston was the destruction of the Colston statue, or not the destruction, the removal by Bristolians
the relocation
of a statue from their own public space, as I prefer to call it. The people who did it, who were brought to court having been acquitted. But it implies that the small group of upper middle class rich movers and shakers in Bristol who had put up that statue in the late 19th century, that their view at that time possibly has more weight than hundreds of Bristolians who have been protesting for decades about the fact that this man was in a prominent position in a strongly multicultural city that is very different to the one that that the statue was first put up in, let alone the city that Colston lived in.
Mm. Yeah, it's fascinating how these documents seek to say that they're engendering conversation and a complete consideration of something, and arguably don't necessarily fully achieve that. It's going to be interesting to see how and when this is first applied. Certainly.
Yes.
Moving on to some good news, though. We have statements from, jointly signed letters, including in the first instance a joint letter to peers in the House of Lords on climate and planning. This is from Friends of the Earth and jointly signed by various people, including the head of the CBA. So I'm trying to just Neil Redfern. I'm just trying to confirm exactly how he's listed here. There you go. Executive Director for the Council of British Archaeology, Neil Redfern.
Yeah.
Now that also comes alongside CIfA, the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, welcoming the Agricultural and Rural Communities Scotland Bill, and stating that they're delighted that the provision has been included, enabling Scottish ministers to fund the protection and enhancement of historic and cultural sites. Is this good news? It sounds as though we actually have, for a while now, you and I and various other colleagues and archaeologists have been hoping for CIfA, for CBA and others to get involved in talking about climate and more broadly paying conditions. We'll come on to that in just a second. Is this has to be good news, doesn't it? Surely, hopefully, maybe, possibly.
Oh God, I'm going to sound like I'm damning faint praise here. Yeah, of course, it's to see any kind of engagement in a public forum from archaeological bodies is to be absolutely welcomed. But at the same time, we had to look for it, didn't we?
Yeah, we did have to go searching, and it is only a jointly signed letter as opposed to a statement of belief outright or statement of intent, outright from for example the CBA. And I suppose a question here would be, and this is genuinely a question, I'm not trying to lead you into like into a wry smile here, what role would CIfA have played, possibly, do we know, in shaping the Agriculture and Rural Communities Scotland Bill?
I think we have to be realistic and say probably not much. But what would have had an effect would be CIfA and the CBA and so on commenting in these situations as part of organised third sector lobby groups and advocacy groups. And so strength in numbers. But also, that doesn't mean though that they should just sort of be quiet about it. And I mean, I don't know about you, but I only knew about this. I didn't find out about this from following the particularly their social media. They didn't make a big we are signing this letter from so and so. Or we've been lobbying on this for some time, and it's very it sort of creeps out. Archaeology seems to is very on most occasions. Archaeology is very slow at coming forward. I think still, and it would be nice to see archaeology as being a bit braver, a bit more proud of it, a bit more proud of the stances that it takes.
Yeah, well, for example, I'm pretty sure. Given that I've been blocked by Neil Redfern on Twitter, I have to look at his Twitter feed in other ways. But I'm pretty sure I didn't see him retweet the letter. He might have done. I might have missed it. But I came across this letter, this jointly signed letter that he had signed through, I think, a CBA account retweet. So again, it wasn't. It was a very quiet pointing to it. And
There was no, for example, there's no CBA press release.
No.
CBA is proud to be supporting that such and such initiative.
Yeah.
We just don't do that as a sector, and
No.
you should.
And I suppose the only reason why, because I really want it, I promise you guys at home, I want to see good news on these fronts. This is the reason why I check these feeds. I want to see, yes, brilliant, fantastic, we're actually saying and doing something. But in this instance, unfortunately, it slightly comes across as possibly fence sitting, because what you can do is you can say to archaeologists, oh no, look, we signed that thing over there, look, we did, but you're not saying anything that might annoy relevant ministers in government. You're going for the ride on a Friends of the Earth letter. So it is good. It's got to be good. It'd just be nice to see something a bit more clear. Though, speaking of clear things, last night, 16 hours ago, or thereabouts, there was a joint statement from the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists and FAME, the Federation of Archaeological Managers and Employers. This was a memorandum of understanding that seemingly caught many archaeologists off guard. Now, we're going to be talking about this, I suspect, in more detail next week. We're probably going to be asking for people if they want, to comment or to maybe even come onto the show and talk a little bit about it. But this memorandum of understanding, on first reading at least, it talks about provision of training, networking, the quality of the profession, hints at pay and conditions and this kind of thing. But the memorandum of understanding appears to be less about, quote, the positive influence each organisation has on the archaeological sector, and more about defining what each of these bodies will do within the sector. It's almost like a statement of we won't tread on each other's toes, as opposed to a statement of cooperation. Although it was launched in the spirit, it seems, of a statement of cooperation. But that didn't seem to last very long, did it, in terms of initial responses to this statement?
I'm not going to prejudge the discussion which we are going to have, but put it this way. If you look at the Facebook feed where it's published by CIfA, it's not. People aren't standing in the aisles clapping.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if you want to leave it there, we can leave it there.
No, in all seriousness, this is in the context of FAME announcing that it was leaving the what's called an industry working group or cross-sector working group. I mean, that in itself was controversial in terms of who was taking part and the transparency of it. But FAME removed themselves from that, claiming that they could be seen as operating as part of a cartel, which would have been illegal. Opinions differed on that, shall we say. And this appears to be some sort of attempt to build a bridge between CIfA and FAME. But I'd ask people to read the MOU and comment and tell us what you think, and whether you think it will actually lead to anything significant, anything helpful to the sector.
Well, I suppose also as well, how does this relate to you? That's why I would ask, is how does this relate to you and your particular part of archaeology as well?
That's a very good point. I mean, what I would say is, if you look at the document, includes a number of definitions and a number of relationships, and I would ask anybody reading it to look at those definitions and those relationships and see where you, as an archaeologist, and maybe a trained and experienced archaeologist, fit in to the worldview that the MOU puts forward.
Yeah. MOU sounds like the MCU, the new archaeological combined universe. With that in mind, we'll see you after this message from us about why you should support this ongoing watching brief endeavour. Catch you in a sec. A watching brief is a formal programme of observation and investigation to record and report on notable discoveries on an archaeological site. As part of our ongoing ongoing watching brief, Andy and I work hard to bring you the best, the worst, and sometimes the more quirky happenings from the world of archaeology. We aim to provide a space where voices can be heard, opinions shared, and sometimes truth spoken to power. If you believe in the work we do, please consider supporting us on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Thank you. Hello and welcome back to the final third of this week's watching brief, where we're going to take a look at a couple of news stories that caught our eye in recent weeks, and that, as I say, we're sort of pushed to one side by events, dear boy, events in the past fortnight. First of all, number one, just a quick announcement, really. There's been a 6th arrest in the case of the Crooked House pub fire investigation. And these arrests appear to be falling broadly in line with previously understood persons of interest surrounding the fire at Crooked House. We have a woman, 34, a man, 44, 3 other men, 66, 51, and 33. And those were the previous arrests, in addition to a 23-year-old man who's now been arrested over the blaze that tore through Crooked House pub on the 5th of August. That's it, really, isn't it? It's an ongoing police investigation, and arrests are being made. Yeah.
Yes, and it would appear that from information that's in the public domain, that the police are working through what appears to be a sort of a network of people who have knowledge of each other, shall we say. And they're continuing to make the arrests under on suspicion of conspiracy to commit arson with intent or being reckless as to whether life was in danger. So again, as we said in a previous watching brief, the upper end of the charges that are potentially available. But again, the 23-year-old person, the most recent person to be arrested, was arrested on the 3rd of October and then released on conditional bail while the investigation continues. And in fact, everybody who's been arrested up until this point remains on conditional bail.
Next we have, and really all of these stories at the end of this watching brief are kind of related to each other in terms of the use of land, various interests and groups surrounding the use of land, and also in that sense potentially heritage sites as well. In this instance, we have the angle, the report that Sunak, the Prime Minister Sunak's, well, here it said spiteful sale of land that had previously been earmarked and or actually purchased for the high-speed rail 2 line going all the way up from Birmingham to Crewe, is designed to dash hopes of revival of that line. Now, the reason why this is important, folks at home, is that for many years now, archaeologists have been, it's no exaggeration to say, recruited from around the world to work on the archaeology ahead of the production of this line, and in so doing, preparing the land for development. Now, the sale of this appears to be designed to make sure that whoever comes in the next government, whether that's a new party or the same party, cannot renew the plan as is today, or certainly as was a couple of days ago. Actually, this was published on the 5th of October as well. So about 8 days ago, maybe a week. But do you think that that's a reasonable reading, and how do you think that relates to all the work that's already gone in? I mean, something that's also been announced as well is the fact that the connection between a place on the edge of London, so the name escapes me for the moment, and Euston, the line where all of the all of the maps previously showing HS2 were showing it beginning in Euston Station. That section is now going to be up to private development and not government funded to go ahead, despite the fact that archaeologists were involved in the removal of a burial ground of tens of thousands of individuals with a sampling strategy in place, is my understanding. For me, I can't help but wonder what this means and what this says about the relationship between archaeology, development, responsible action, and also not being able to read the tea leaves and see the future. It is a difficult position to be in, isn't it? I suppose, because it's not like we could say, well, this might not occur, and therefore we won't do the archaeology as a profession. But I think the crew to Birmingham line is deeply unfortunate. But the Euston Station story, or the burial ground near Euston Station, for me really smacks of a slightly unfortunate unfolding I saw some people saying it was essentially a desecration of a burial ground. For what now? There's going to be no railway unless it's privately funded.
The word clusterfuck springs to mind. Omnishambles. It's being pointed out that less than 2 years ago, Sunak, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, signed off on the on HS2 to get to Manchester, on the similar projections to the ones that he's now cancelled it. It is an absolute mess, and in some might say it's typical of his sort of, or at least of the allegedly spiteful nature of the current government, that he appears to be trying to prevent anybody reviving the project in future, hence the sale of the land. The particular situation in London, and again, people who live in London declare an interest, I do, are spitting tax over this, because Old Oak Common in North Acton, actually, it's less romantically, you could say it's actually the closest place that people might have actually heard of is Wormwood Scrubs Nick.
Okay.
It's it happens to interlink with the new Elizabeth line, the Lizzie line, which is the Crossrail, as it used to be called. But Crossrail was never designed to take intercity traffic, and it's ludicrous to have got so far and not to have completed the project. The other thing about the Euston area, the archaeology isn't in vain, because the way the government is playing this, it's very canny and really quite, shall we say, calculated. The Euston platform, the numbers, even if it's privately funded, to extend from Old Oak Common into Euston, there won't be enough platforms to carry the capacity to extend north. There'll be enough capacity to do the Birmingham shuttle, but nothing serious else. So and the land where the platforms for the extra capacity that would have enabled it to go to take the traffic from Manchester will actually be sold off to private developers, which would potentially bring the government in a windfall of cash, and also prevent the project being revived. And there'd be a shortcut because the archaeology has already been done.
Well, this is true. Although this things only happen on that land that's purchased by developers if the developers actually choose to do something on it. One of the interesting stories that came out also in recent days is quote, damning HBF. That's the Home Builders Federation report reveals the extent of England's housing crisis. This is actually a very acute issue. There is a tremendous pressure on the housing market, not least the rental market, and people need homes. But this, as you pointed out, this is actually an interest group, a think tank, who very much are in the developers' corner. And there's this thing called land banking. There actually is lots of land around the country that could be built on, but it's being held held on to
And
until
that's land, and that's not just land that could be built on. That's land with planning permission.
yeah, yeah. But it's being held on to until it, its value matures and building on it can yield the maximum profit. So these things are interlinked and they are connected. And people at home, I'm sure some people would be like, "But we need to build." Of course, we need to build. But it's interesting how, and I think it's just a little bit tragic how archaeology as a profession, in terms of its survival, has decided to hang its hat for the most part on these sorts of developments, especially big developments, and yet the good work, the ethical work surrounding, for example, the removal of bodies from a cemetery, from burial ground, doesn't seem to float up the chain in terms of the commitment to make sure that treatment of the dead, and this is something that archaeologists are concerned about. Treatment of the dead is important. It's part, it's also mandated by the Home Office. Isn't in vain. That it's that we haven't just plucked them out of the ground like potatoes for a whim, or worse still, possibly for an interesting headline. I seem to recall at the time we covered the story of was it a mountaineer? His name escapes me momentarily, who had been buried in that particular burial ground. And
it wasn't a mountaineer. I think it was the Australian explorer Matthew Flinders.
Explorer. Sorry, yeah. Yes, that was him. Yes, that was it. And this work has to be, I would argue, has to be at its best, more than just for good headlines. I'm not suggesting that's why it was done, but when these sorts of medium to long term planning decisions can be just flicked on a switch, it makes planning for business in the north, it makes planning for archaeological recruitment, it makes planning for cultural stewardship, and also as well makes planning actually for post-ex considerations, things like where you're going to store material after it's been taken out of the ground. It makes it all much more difficult when these things come and go like the wind, and also when the cost balloons. It's been pointed out as well at the same time as these stories coming out that here in the UK such infrastructure costs factors of 10 times more than it does in other countries. Germany, it's roughly 10 times more. Japan, the factor is even worse. They're far more efficient at building and far quicker at building infrastructure when it needs to go ahead.
There's another factor in play at the moment, though, and that is that, for example, I think we mentioned it before as well, that construction costs, particularly materials like concrete, in the last couple of years have increased in cost massively, partly due to the war in Ukraine and also the pandemic and so on. But it is now much more expensive to build a major project than it was even just a couple of years ago. So and that's nothing to do with the planning issues. That's to do with just the global economy.
Well, this is true, but in that same space of time, in fact, in less time than when spades first went into the ground on this project.
Oh, do we have to use that phrase? It makes it sound as though the modern construction industry are like 19th century navvies.
Well, that's just how the Prime Minister thinks about it, apparently.
But pay everybody like 19th century navvies.
Within that space of time, there are other countries. I believe it was Taiwan, possibly, have launched actually a high-speed rail network and brought it to public use, despite those financial pressures. Now, again, there's all sorts of other geopolitics going on there. There's all sorts of other things
and
geography, yes, driving these things. But I just think it's a shame. I just think it's a real shame. And also, going back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier in terms of joint announcements and memorandums of understanding and so on and so forth between sector leaders. Incidentally, as well, I seem to recall when we talked about big issues linked with FAME previously, one of their responses was, "But we're only a small organisation. We can't possibly be asked to," it's just this weird thing of wanting to have your cake and eat it in terms of being a manager, but also not being held accountable for things.
Yeah.
But in this instance, where is the foresight on projects like this? I remember when I was younger, about 10 years ago, I remember thinking actually is there any guarantee that any of this is going to happen? And why are we hanging all of our hats on this? Why are we putting so many eggs in this basket? And yes, a lot of the archaeology did occur, but I think you were saying that that there'd been reports that as soon as sections were questioned, the number of archaeologists involved in these sorts of projects disappeared overnight. You know, it's. I just feel as though if you're going to have these organisations saying we're working together for the future of archaeology, we need to start doing archaeology in a different way. We can't keep on being so vulnerable, frankly, to these sorts of policy decision. What's the word? Flip flopping, I guess, or you know, medium and long term decision making
Look,
going awry.
Regardless of where we stand on this and with the organisations concerned, and in fact that comment was about the archaeological jobs being lost was reported by Kenneth Aitchison, who runs Fame. And he was quoting a project manager at a very senior project manager at HS2. At a conference.
So in that sense, he's aware of the issues, then.
Very much so, clearly so. But and yes, because basically the pipeline of work from HS2 is essentially gone. Has gone in less than a year, from being one of the biggest employers in archaeology to zip. And what the government was very careful to frame its decision, which we know was made some time ago, but there was all sorts of, the narrative was all over the place. Sunak finally announced it in his speech at the Conservative Party conference last week. And he announced Network North as the replacement for HS2, the idea of linking up northern cities and so on, listed a whole series of projects which within 24 hours had begun to completely unravel. Even as he was sitting down from his speech, people pointed out that one of the projects that he announced, tram link from Manchester to Manchester Airport, had actually already been built. It was that badly put together by his staffers in Downing Street, which makes you think the whole thing was just cobbled together as a fig leaf for a decision that had already been made, and they needed to provide some sort of public justification, and that's what they came up with. And subsequently, Mark Harper, the Transport Secretary, and then Sunak himself said that, actually, all these projects that we've announced, they're not projects that are going to be built. It's indicative of what might happen.
Yeah, flavors. Flavors of what might happen.
So, archaeologists thinking, okay, HS2's gone, but here's a whole list of projects which might well bring developer-funded archaeology.
No, exactly, and that's exactly my point. In that sense, archaeology is an afterthought of a get me through this day, please, kind of type of speech.
I will be willing to bet you that the word archaeology wasn't even mentioned in Downing Street when Sunak was making that decision.
Oh, of course not. Naturally, of course not. Absolutely not. But that's why we need to have organisations who don't just sort of claim victories after the fact on policy decisions, and organisations who do at least try and get the word archaeology into some of these considerations, because we can't be, if FAME and CIfA want to have this memorandum of understanding and have a way forward, and again we'll be coming back to this in more detail next week, I know, then there needs to be a serious, considered approach to what the future of archaeological funding in the sector looks like. Now, there is something here that I know I asked you last week, I think, and that is whether or not actually the traditional idea of what archaeology looks like is simply no longer applicable. But I don't think we need to necessarily go into that today. Again, we can come back to that next week. It may well be that actually we are seeing a new chapter in archaeology, possibly. But at the very least, it needs to be more than what's the next big government civil engineering project. It needs to be more than that. Otherwise, I just don't see how the churn, in particular of young archaeologists, is going to be solved. That issue of young graduates going in, working their little backsides off and then having no real
burning out.
future in the career
Yeah,
because they burn out
yeah,
due to, either they just can't afford to keep on doing it, or there's no way for their career to progress. That needs to be tackled, and I'm not sure that we're actually seeing that yet. Anyway, I'm slightly rambling here, but yeah. Finally, we have two updates on planning stories, I suppose. We have, first of all, the Scampton RAF base, where a stop notice has failed to halt. This was on October the 4th. Halt work at the RAF Scampton former base, as the Home Office has pressed ahead with its work despite written assurance it was going to comply with an order to stop. Is this a case of see previous comments on creating a precedent, or creating a fait accompli?
yeah. Look, I'm increasingly of the opinion that if archaeologists want to see an influence on government when it comes to heritage issues, it has to be, you have to do it through the courts. Because there is no archaeology. Well, say there is no archaeological. There is an archaeological lobby, but it's so quiet and so apparently ineffectual that serious things are being allowed to happen, and there's no attempt to stall them. In
For
the way
example, to follow up in cases like Old Oswestry Hill Fort.
that exactly that there appears to have been no attempt to take a very contentious issue to judicial review. And I'm still hoping to clarify that situation, but I'm to be frank, I'm no, I'm not astounded. Actually, it's sort of what I was expecting, but I find it,
Well, it's a little bit like what I was saying
astonishing.
before. I hope to be in a situation where I'm astounded, but
Yeah,
unfortunately, all too often, you're not actually
yeah,
surprised by this. You know.
yeah. Where we do have potentially significant things going to court, first of all, is on Scampton. The East Lindsey District Council, whose remit Scampton would fall under the Town and Country Planning Act, is seeking a judicial review of the Home Office's decision to build a camp for male asylum seekers on former RAF Scampton. The situation as it stands is, well, let's say the most recent information in the public domain was a press release on the 4th of October. This is ahead of a judicial review that is due to be heard at the end of the month, the end of this month, October 2023. But basically, the council confirmed, or at least it said that it had received confirmation in writing from the Home Office that it had stopped all work in compliance with the stop order issued by the council on 22nd of September. And that stop order was on the grounds, particularly that heritage issues hadn't been taken into account, that should have been taken into account under the planning process. They didn't have planning permission, and the work was unlawful. And this is the kicker. It says, unfortunately, despite written assurances to the contrary, it is clear activity consists at pace on site. It says that they'd sought change of use without planning permission. They'd cited porta cabins and intensive groundworks without planning permission. They referred to the heritage issues in that stop notice. It does appear that the Home Office has decided. Well, first of all, the Home Office claimed that they had jurisdiction anyway. There's a lot of contradictory information coming out of government on this. At various times, the Home Office seems to have claimed it had jurisdiction anyway and didn't require planning permission. At other times, like this, they've engaged and said, "Yeah, well, we're going to comply with your instruction, with your stop notice. Yeah, you know, it is possible the right hand isn't talking to the left hand. It is possibly more likely that basically it's throwing up a whole load of chaff with the intention of creating a fait accompli, so that when it goes to judicial review, even if the judge finds that the government has acted unlawfully, the judge will make the decision that actually it's not in the public interest to reverse the works. It's already happened. Rap the government on the knuckles, and the government gets its way.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, both the Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper and the leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, at the Labour conference this week, both said in interviews that they would cancel Scampton and return it to the local authority so that they could carry through their investment programme, which they're furious at having had to put on hold. They claim they had over £300 million worth of investment for the site. And and without any kind of serious consultation at all, the Home Office has just basically knocked that on the head.
Well, and the thing is, to be clear, the heritage concerns here were initially potentially addressed by the Inheritor Unit, Squadron number
617.
617. That's it. I always get it wrong. 617, when they said that they could, maybe move aspects of the site and have a plaque and so on and so forth in their new site, but then that was not seen to be the case, or to be sufficient.
Well, put it this way: it was thrown out unceremoniously because it was an awful application that should never have even gone to the council. It was so bad.
Yeah.
County Archaeology. I wrote if people can look it up on the article I wrote on Pipeline about it. But basically, it was an incredibly thin, badly argued piece of work. It was as though somebody was going through the motions.
Yeah. No. Exactly. And I suppose this is kind of what I'm getting at, is that heritage has been at the heart of this, and in that sense, physical archaeological remains are there, and yet it is an element of going through the motions, and that kind of connects to what we've just been talking about, about the extent to which archaeology, if for example, I believe, again, to briefly go back to the MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, there's this notion of a chartered profession by 2030. Well, I mean, that's all well and good, but that's 7 years away, and at the moment, you can't get people to take military remains seriously in government. Never mind your more niche stuff. That archaeologists are interested in.
Well, not just military remains. Military remains related to the most famous squadron in the Royal Air Force, and one of the most famous British movies ever made.
Yeah. So where? Again, this is a conversation for next week. But where's the voice that's going to be taken seriously on this? And it sounds as though Lindsey Council or West Lindsey Council is actually doing an awful lot of the work here.
In the end, the voice that is going to be taken seriously is that of the court. West Lindsey Council's taking the Home Office to court. A judge will have their view, and even if they do take the view that it's not in the public interest to reverse the works. If West Lindsey win, but the government just gets a rap on the knuckles, at least the principle will have been established that what the government did was unlawful. Now, there's another case that came out last week as well, which is also potentially significant in heritage terms and in planning terms. It took place actually just a click down the road from where I live, at a place called Mast, Quay, on the Thames waterfront at Woolwich. And this is to do with a development of housing blocks, tower blocks, that were given planning permission in 2012. 2 blocks were built and are fine. A further 2 blocks, the developer went bust, and it was bought out. The site was bought out by an Irish company called Coma Homes, the Coma Homes Group. It's owned by 2 Irish billionaire brothers, and they built had planning permission for 2 further towers. It was called Mast Quay Phase 2, which was to build flats for rental. But last week, Greenwich Council announced that basically there were 26 deviations from the original planning permission, and that they had to be taken down. Now that's pretty, that's about as severe as council enforcement can get.
Yeah. Well, apparently
Among the check,
I thought you were probably about to say this, but apparently these included visible changes to the external appearance of the towers, and also increasing their approved size of the footprint of the towers. I mean, this is basic stuff, isn't it? Didn't they think they were going to get checked?
well, this is the thing. The 2 towers were something like, it averages out at about 5% bigger in footprint than they should have been.
Yeah.
There are no roof gardens or children's play areas that were promised. The flats are described as low quality. The accessible apartments actually have steps onto the balconies, so wheelchair users couldn't use them.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
They built they failed to provide an underground car park, so they replaced a landscape garden and play with a car park. There were no disabled parking bays, and there was a poor quality footbridge across the site to what's called Woolwich Church Street, which is actually up towards I think it's Grade 2 listed Georgian church.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the local councillors described it as a mutant development.
Wow.
The Councillor Aidan Smith is a cabinet member for regeneration in the Royal Borough of Greenwich, and I have to say, to go interest, I am a Greenwich voter. I voted for these people. But and this is the full quote. Councillor Aidan Smith: Mast Quay Phase 2 development had the potential to deliver hundreds of beautiful riverside apartments in an exciting area of London with a rich maritime past. Instead, what we have is a mutant development that's a blight on the landscape, local conservation zone, and heritage assets and views. That's putting heritage right at the heart of what Coma Homes have done.
So is this again a developer trying to create essentially a fait accompli? It's like, it's built now.
Well, I'm not going to make it. I'm not going to make a value judgment on that. It has to be said. Coma Homes have said that asking the council putting an enforcement notice in and saying that they have to take the towers down is disproportionate, and they argue that the council's conclusions that it cites in its enforcement notice. But it has to. But against that it has to be pointed out that the company was told to stop letting homes to residents, and at the time of writing, the London Evening Standard reported this week that they were still letting homes in those condemned blocks to residents. And the and there's been some pushback against the council, with people saying, well, it is that they're there now. Why we need houses and flats? Why not let them? They were there for rental, and so on. The point is, if planning means anything, it has to be honoured by both sides. And for 26 reasons, the Royal Borough of Greenwich say Coma Homes basically took the piss. They saw planning permission as a birthday card. Thank you very much.
Yeah, or something they'll get around to at the end of the project. Yeah. On a slightly lighter note, I suppose, if we still did the Muppet of the Month segment, which seemed to have sort of slightly sidetracked in recent months and years, partly because also the news that we talk about these days is very serious, relatively serious. There are still stories that make us smile, or at the very least make us aghast with the cheek of the people involved. In this instance, it's the story of the Traveller's Rest, Long Royston, I believe, a developer who demolished Yorkshire Village pub without consent, loses planning appeal as inspector finds rebuild of the pub does not have, well, it doesn't have some key aspects that you might expect in a pub, does it?
Well, a bar, a kitchen, and loos. And
So I just imagine the developer turning up and just going, "This looks suspiciously like Holmes." Like that.
yeah, well, you read the article, and we'll link to it below the line. The developer, as I say, demolished the pub, which again was about the same age as the cricket house, a couple of 100 years old. Demolished it without permission. Was told to rebuild it as a functioning pub.
Yep.
Rebuilt it ostensibly as a functioning pub, but when the building inspectors went in to check it complied with the planning order, they found that there was no bar, there was no loos available for the users, and there was no functioning pub kitchen. But what they were what appeared to be the footprint of two houses, complete with two gardens.
Oh.
And
Now, is that just referring to the previous story? Is that going to be the name of this pub, Taking the Piss?
or not taking the piss, as there weren't any loos.
Well, no, take your piss home. Yeah.
Well, I think we're getting it. I think we're getting into dark places where we really shouldn't be going. But yeah, I mean, this is the kind of story when archaeologists bend over backwards to be nice about property developers and say how we want to work with the industry and so on.
Yeah.
This is the reason why people like me say, yeah, that's fine, but do it with a very, very long spoon. This is supping with the devil. So yeah, I mean, this is an industry that includes people like this.
Yeah.
And anyway, it's going to be back with the council and the council enforcement teams and so on, and we'll see what happens. But one would like to think that they'll stick to their guns, and at some point in the future there will be a newly functioning pub, complete with a kitchen so that you can order your lunch and visit the boys, girls, or unbranded loos before you head for home.
To be fair, I think if I was that way inclined, I'd try and say it's a traditional pub experience. We don't do food here, and we'd have a drain out back where you can do your business.
Yes. Is that how they do it in Newcastle?
Well, it's oh, come on, it's how old pubs used to do it. Just very briefly, one of my favorite anecdotes that Mrs. Soup tells from when she was a student working in a pub in Oxford. She actually worked at the Eagle and Child, in fact, where
right, yes,
yeah,
I know
where the Inklings met.
That's right, yeah. Yes, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien and
yeah, exactly. And what just talking about this notion of an authentic pub experience, she'd often have people coming in, unfortunately often from America, it just was the case, and they'd say, excuse me, what on the menu would Tolkien have maybe have eaten? What would be what would be an authentic dish to order? And she'd go all the way through and say, well, actually, to be fair, we didn't serve food when they were drinking here. No pub did. But I guess you could go for the steak and kidney pie with peas, that'd be, and they go, okay, we'll have the teriyaki chicken. And and then, similarly, it would be a case of like, well, what sort of beer would they have drunk, and she'd go all the way through. And she knew this was going to happen every time. It got to a point, well, I'll say where it got to. She'd go through the whole list of these cask ales, these sort of beautiful, selected, seasonal things, and drinks, traditional beers, and they'd end up ordering a Budweiser. And it was just like, so that's, again, I'm not saying everyone from the US is like this, but she let's say she had a very strong sample to draw on in terms of tourism, and eventually what she ended up doing was when people asked for a traditional beer, she'd just serve some Heineken, which she considered to be well, funnily enough, speaking of taking the piss, she considered it not to be a great drink. So that we can you can
Was it,
market
is that
anything as a
the
traditional
same
experience.
Heineken where the joke is it's brewed in England by Great Danes?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Great Danes. And again, we get round to that traditional experience round the back of the pub. Yeah, it's where you get your Great Dane beer from.
Yes. But the other joke from I remember from my younger Camera Beer Festival days. It's those kind of mass-produced cask beers that taste the same going in as they would going out.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I can. Yeah.
But anyway.
Anyway, we have plumbed from where we began this week's watching brief to where we are now. It has been quite a journey. I suppose you there was something else that you wanted to say, wasn't there, on the opening section of watching brief?
It's just in wrapping up. Yeah. I would say to people, obviously, watch the news, but ask questions, and don't feel you have to watch every single news bulletin. It's for your own, for the sake of your own mental health, I think. This is one of those stories, I think, which is just is only going to get worse before it gets better. And certainly there have been a lot of warnings on social media in the last few days about looking at some of the video material that's being posted, fake or not, wherever it's sourced. And we've had stuff from the Syrian civil war being recast as being contemporary and from Gaza, and so on and so on and so on. It's grim. But the other thing to keep an eye on, stepping back from it for a moment, from a point of view of fake news and fake history and so on, is to watch what happens with Facebook and with X/Twitter, and X in particular, because it's been announced that the European Union has started a formal investigation into the content that X has been publishing, and that potentially could lead to some very large fines, and in extremis it could lead to the platform being banned in the European Union. It's under a new piece of European Union legislation called the Digital Services Act, which puts a requirement on digital publishers to act responsibly and to remove illegal or fake content as soon as possible. Which X/Twitter can find somewhat more difficult than it was before Galaxy Brain Elon took it over, because one of the things he's done is almost eliminate the checks and balances within Twitter by sacking most of the moderators and fact checkers, and in particular the team that looked at political advertising and election security and so on.
But he is a free speech absolutist, and politically really has no real leaning. Okay, apparently he doesn't really lean either way.
To which I would just say, if you're a free speech absolutist, stand up in the middle of a packed cinema and shout fire and see where that gets you.
Yeah, probably trampled. So with this need for genuine resources and genuine ways of helping, Andy has an idea for the link of the week this week, don't you?
Yeah. Earlier on, I was listening to an interview with the local coordinator for the International Committee of the Red Cross, who is working in southern Israel, Gaza, to try and alleviate the situation facing everybody. So that they're involved in everything from trying to establish whether hostages taken by Hamas are still alive and where they are, and that their welfare is being looked at, to the situation facing ordinary Gazans without or diminishing supplies of food, water, medical aid, and so on. They need all the help they can get.
Yeah,
the Red Cross. So I think I'd like to make that our link of the week.
Okay, yep, that makes sense. We'll also as well link below to our respective new Blue Sky social accounts. We've both been looking for an alternative to Twitter since it looked at various times like it was imminently about to close. In fact, a couple of times. I initially jumped onto Threads when that opened, but that, for various reasons, hasn't really worked out. So that account no longer exists. However, we do both have Blue Sky Social profiles. We'll link below to them. And if you are a friend or colleague who needs access to the platform, we also both have tokens that we can hand out to let people on. Initially, I'll be honest, I was a little bit concerned about the platform being a closed, gated community. But actually, it's reached a point now, a sort of critical mass, where the people on there are varied and the sort of people that I wanted to follow on Twitter. But also as well, it seems that actually getting access is less of an issue. So at the moment, for example, I have 4 codes waiting to go, and so I'm more and more in the spirit of accessible public archaeology sort of action, more and more comfortable with that as a platform. Just thought I'd just make that clear. But I mean, how are you finding this movement from Twitter? Because in that sense, it is this thing of comms is an aspect of what we often talk about on Watching Brief.
That's right. I mean, I'm finding. I mean, like you, I jumped to Threads that weekend when it looked as though Twitter was going to go down like the Titanic, and then the ship steadied for a bit, and then I found Threads wasn't working for me. The other thing, the big killer for me was that Threads isn't compliant with. I talked about the EU just now. Isn't compliant with EU data regulations, and so wasn't available to colleagues in the European Union, which to me makes it useless. But Blue Sky does seem to be available pretty much universally. You do need an access code, but I'm still on X, Twitter. Anyone who follows me, if you need an access code for Blue Sky, would like an access code for Blue Sky, just DM me on X.
Likewise.
And I may offer other opportunities if that isn't taken up. But yeah, I mean, the thing I would say, Blue Sky doesn't have all the functionality that Twitter did. Or does, but I've so far, with some exceptions, but very many, the majority of the people I was following on, X Twitter, as we should now call it, perhaps, very many of them are over in Blue Sky, and it's much easier to use than Mastodon. So overall, I think it has possibilities. They're adding new functionalities, and in fact, they've also one of the engineers was being quoted in the computing media earlier on this week. I think it was that they're going to be upping their server capacity, and that they've passed something like 1.5 million users, which is tiny compared to the Galaxy Brains platform. But more fool him, because if more and more of them are migrating, and it's people who you want to follow, you want to hear. The big thing for me, and the reason I've stopped posting on Twitter / X or X Twitter, is it's a moral thing. It's Musk's at best idiotic, at worst fascist adjacent behaviour, and that's driving away the people and the legitimate, the journalists, the archaeologists, the media people, and so on. The big problem in the end, it was blue tick. Blue tick used to be a sign of quality. It was people, significant media organisations whose content you could trust. It was brilliant at breaking news stories, whether it was an archaeological story or whether it was a hard news story. Now you have to cut your way through thickets of rubbish and adverts faking the idea that Chris Packham or David Attenborough have gone in for some cryptocurrency scam. And no, it's becoming unusable.
Yeah. Well, I think that was Andy's TED talk there.
Yes.
Thank you guys for watching. As I say, next week we're likely to be returning to this issue of, this development of the memorandum of understanding between FAME and CIfA, FAME and CIfA. And to that end, if you have any thoughts or opinions, please do reach out. We'd like to include you. We can also include you anonymously, as long as we know who you are behind the scenes, as it were. To that end, again, you can reach out to us in anywhere that you can find us. Really, basically, as I say, Twitter DMs are still open, and there is also the email on screen below as well. Until then, guys, do take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye.